All right, we are going to be covering the female reproductive portion of chapter 27 now. So we already focused on the male reproductive system, and so this beginning of the lecture actually is pretty much the same as we saw for the male reproductive system. The female reproductive system produces ovum, remember? They're not called eggs, they're ovum. And when the egg and the sperm come together, they unite to form the zygote. So the reproductive system in females are called ovaries. The ova are produced by the ovaries. In addition, there are sex hormones produced by the ovaries. The reproductive tract itself contains the ovaries, the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. Now, the uterus itself also produces hormones, which we'll get to in a little bit. The external genitalia consist of the vulva and the perineum. The mammary glands are a part of the female reproductive system. However, they're not involved in fertilization, but the mammary glands produce food or milk for the offspring. So let's start by looking at the anatomy of the female reproductive system. So in the abdominal cavity, extending down through the skeleton, we have the pubic symphysis. The urinary system is anterior to the female reproductive system. So here's the urinary bladder right here, and the urethra. All right, it's totally separate from the female reproductive system, which contains, first of all, the ovary, which is superior to the uterus. All right, so here's the uterus right here, kind of a C-shaped structure in cross-section. The uterine tube or the fallopian tube is associated with the ovary, and we have the ovarian follicle right up through here. Okay, we'll get to that in a little bit. The uterine tube connects to kind of the posterior side of the uterus. The uterus is made of the myometrium. Remember, myo means muscle. The perimetrium and the endometrium. The endometrium is the interior lining of the uterine cavity here. The uterus is sitting, I guess you would say superior, not necessarily dorsal, but superior to the urinary bladder. And it is anterior to the rectum and the sigmoid colon right here. The uterus itself consists of the external portion, which is the fornix, or kind of the, I guess you'd say pointy part. The cervix is the opening of the uterus, and then the vagina is the region where the penis enters for fertilization. The vagina ends with the labium minoris, which is the interior lip of the labia, and then the labium majoris, which is the external lip of the vagina. The clitoris is a small organ in the anterior portion of the female reproductive system, which we'll get to in a little bit. We have the vestibular gland, and this has nothing to do with the vestibular system, you guys. The periurethral glands, which are adjacent to the urethra, and then the urethra itself, which are separate from the female reproductive system. So if we're looking at a frontal view of the female reproductive system, here's the uterus, and it's always kind of called a pear-shaped structure, an inverted pear. The uterus has associated with it the uterine or fallopian tubes in the kind of the dorsolateral surface. The ovarian ligament suspends the ovaries adjacent to the uterus, and then we have this broad ligament here that helps support the ovaries and the uterine tube and the fimbriae here. The fimbriae are these kind of feathery little fingers associated with or adjacent to the ovary. The ovary will produce ovum, which are released into the fimbriae and then will travel down the uterine tube via ciliary motion from ciliated cells that are inside of the uterine tube. The uterus and the ovaries are supplied, just the ovaries, but actually the dorsolateral portion of the uterus as well, are supplied with vasculature via the ovarian artery and the ovarian vein. And then the suspensory ligaments are also going to be helping to support the ovaries and the fimbriae and uterine tubes. So when we take a cross section through an ovary, what you're going to be seeing are a series of follicles, which we'll talk about for meiosis in a few minutes, that are going to produce ova. Now, I did say that they're called ova, not eggs. Having said that, they call this the egg nest. I don't know what to say. So the egg nest is a region where you're going to see a numerous kind of quiescent or proliferative, meiotically active ova. The ovary is surrounded by the tunica. Check this out, abulgina. We saw that before with the testes. Inside of the ovary, we have the cortex, the corpus luteum, which is going to be producing hormones, and then the medulla is the region that contains a number of blood vessels. These blood vessels are going to be supplying lots of oxygen and nutrients to the meiotic cells that are going to be producing ova. The uterine tube here, or the tube that's going to be associated with the ovaries, attached to the ovary through the ovarian hilum, and then here's a section of broad ligament that's helping to support the ovaries. So what's going to happen is you'll have the ovary producing an ovum. The ovum will travel down through the uterine tube. Usually fertilization happens in the uterine tube, and then the zygote will land somewhere in the uterus to develop into offspring. The uterus will protect and allow the development of the offspring, the fetus, and eventually during birth and partition, the fetus will exit through the cervix and travel through the vaginal opening. So the ovaries responsible for the production of ova, but also the ovaries produce a couple different hormones. Probably the most famous is estrogen. The ovaries are housed in the lateral pelvic wall, and they're held in place through ligaments, the mesovarium, which is the part of the broad ligament, the ovarian ligament, and the suspensory ligament, which holds the ovary to the actual pelvic wall itself. The hilus contains lots of blood vessels to allow oxygenation and nutrients to get to the ovaries. And then the ovary itself, which we looked at, has the germinal epithelium, which is where meiosis is going to be taking place. It's a real simple cuboidal epithelium, but we'll look at that in a little bit in terms of production of cells that are going to make ova. The tunica abulgina, which is fibrous connective tissue. And then the ovarian follicles. You have the primordial follicles, the primary follicles, secondary, the Graafian follicles, which are also called tertiary follicles, the corpus luteum, and the corpus albicans. So oogenesis is the process by which an ovum is produced. So oogonia are the stem cells for the ova. And remember, like I said before, a stem cell divides to produce a primary cell that's going to then undergo meiosis, but then the stem cell reproduces itself. That is part of the definition of what a stem cell is. So this would be the stem cell, or the oogonia, and then this cell down here would be the primary, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that. That cell would be the primary oocyte. My finger touched the touch screen here. And so primary oocytes begin their meiosis before birth, okay, by about 5 months old in a female fetus, which is kind of crazy, right? But after meiosis 1, the secondary oocyte, and we'll see a picture of this in a few minutes, a graphic of this, and the first polar cell is generated, and then meiosis stops, okay? The secondary oocyte will be released through ovulation, so we'll get to that in a few minutes, and then fertilization can occur at this stage, but this happens way after puberty. So this is post-puberty, okay? So the first division actually happens during fetal maturation or fetal development. So this is our graphic showing the primary oocyte, which is diploid. It undergoes S phase to produce the primary oocyte. So this is a diploid cell that reproduces itself. Okay. Then you have the primary oocyte. This oocyte divides, producing 2 cells. The first polar body, which is then going to either divide or not, and the secondary oocyte over here, which is eventually going to develop into the actual ovum. All right. So this first polar body is usually basically doesn't undergo meiosis or division. Again, it might or might not, but then it becomes reabsorbed by the body. So this is basically knocking off one of the first cells during that occurs due to the first division in meiosis 1. The second division in meiosis 2, you get a second polar body, and that cell undergoes resorption. So out of 4 possibilities, okay, so this is one which can turn into 2 cells, and then this is a division that can turn into 2 cells. 3 of the 4 possibilities are taken off the table and reabsorbed by the body. So meiosis 1 is completed shortly before ovulation. So the first division happens, and then the cell just sits there, right? And that happens before birth. You have to wait for puberty before meiosis 1 completes. Ovulation then, and then fertilization can occur after meiosis 2 happens. And then, of course, after fertilization occurs, you end up with a zygote. So what happens to all these additional follicles, right? So the primary oocytes are surrounded by primordial follicles. This is a simple squamous follicular layer, and at puberty, these about 20 primordial follicles are stimulated by follicle-stimulating hormone to become primary follicles. So that's the primary oocyte and several layers of follicle cells. These cells, these follicles, then become secondary follicles. They enlarge, and only one secondary follicle develops each month and into a tertiary follicle or a Graafian follicle. This is really large. It contains lots of fluid, and this is where meiosis 1 is finished, and then the cell transitions to the secondary oocyte. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, stimulates the ovulation, which releases that secondary oocyte and some of the follicle cells from the ovary, and then the oocyte can travel through the tubule for fertilization. The empty follicle itself starts secreting progesterone and estrogen. Look at that. There's another side of progesterone secretion, that would be the uterus, but there's a lot of progesterone produced initially during that release of the ovule. So here's the ovarian cycle. You start with the primordial cells. During step 1, the formation of the primary follicle occurs. Step 2, the formation of the secondary follicle. Step 3, the formation of the tertiary follicle. So this is what we always remember looking like, or at least the appearances of the mature tertiary follicle. During ovulation, the secondary follicle becomes raised, and eventually the actual oocyte becomes released and can enter the tubule for fertilization. So the fallopian tubes, or the uterine tubes, are hollow muscular tubes. These contain smooth muscle, and they extend laterally from the uterus. There's the infundibulum, which expands into a funnel shape into the ampulla, or the fimbriae. Okay, the ampulla and the fimbriae. The ampulla is the tube region of smooth muscle that contracts slightly to move the gamete into the isthmus, where fertilization usually occurs. Short region of the tube nearest the uterus, and then the intramural portion is the junction between the uterine cavity and the isthmus of the fallopian tube. So peristalsis and cilia are going to move the ovum or the zygote, if fertilization took place, along the tube into the uterus. The uterus itself provides a tremendous amount of protection, nutritional support, waste removal. We didn't talk about that very much. The developing fetus and the embryo. And the muscular contractions of the uterus expel the fetus during birth and delivery. And so the uterus is located anterior to the urinary bladder, and it's held in place by the broad ligaments, the uterosacral ligaments, the round ligaments, and the lateral ligaments. So we will start with the 2 regions well, let's finish this up, and then we will go into part 2. There are 2 regions of the uterus, the body and the fundus. So the body of the uterus is the majority of the uterus here, and then the fundus of the uterus is the top part here. The body contains the top curved part and the isthmus of the uterine tubes, and the uterine cavity right in here. The cervix extends from the isthmus and has this, will contain the cervical canal right here and opens into the vagina where basically you can, or basically this is where the offspring are expelled out into the vagina for birth. We will continue on in part 2, the female reproductive system, next.